Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Chapter 3, let's go. In chapter 3, I'm going to show you how a person can develop or can grow attached to the mentality of transsexuality. Transsexuality is often chosen for different reasons. As previously mentioned, one of the main reasons is the belief to be able to get without getting, thinking of finding a hack or a shortcut to gain and enjoy. However, unnoticed, without warning, this hack often evolves. Transsexual people can grow to see transsexuality not only as fun, but something deeper as a dating relationship. Transsexuality can evolve to getting attached to the feeling of having someone with them that brings them good, pleasant feelings. This pleasant feeling that grows in them is just like the feeling that grows in people in a heterosexual relationship towards the opposite gender. A transgender person can start to consider companionship through the thoughts and the simulated feeling of there being someone else with them. This mental attaching mechanism is very common in many people in different situations. As for example, when someone gets attached to their pet, when someone gets attached to the people they've been working with every day for many years, when someone gets attached to someone else because they've been friends for a long time, etc. Perks of transsexuality too. Another perk of transsexuality is to be able to do whatever they want or like with the entity they bring or add to themselves. Transsexuality gives them charge and or control over anything they want to do with their addition or new entity. This can be sexual as well as emotional. Limits seem to be abundant. Through transsexuality, a person can mentally manipulate the new addition or entity on themselves however they like. Mostly do react however they will please, often in a way that will turn them on or make them feel good about themselves, passing their own controlled fabricated responses and orders as if the new entity was voluntarily, organically responding. In reality, the new addition will only be reading and acting the script the director in charge of the scene or movie clip is having them say. Take 15. Action. The way manipulating responses come to be or take place in the director's minds or vision is by projecting a probable thinking how the opposite gender will think and respond, and however the main person in charge, which is the director, which is the original biological person or the host, will want them to respond. This next subchapter is called Imaginary Friend. Imaginary Friend can basically explain to you the step process of how transsexuality works in the mind of people with gender dysphoria of all ages. Adults, juveniles, teenagers, or just the little kids. Imaginary Friend. It isn't uncommon to see a kid having an imaginary friend, where the kid and the imaginary friend get to play, chat, share, and have a good time together. What we need to pay attention to is what the mind of the kid is doing. The kid with an imaginary friend is creating a fictitious entity using her imagination. The reason or purpose will often be to cope better with something negative or missing in his or her life, like boredom, loneliness, anxiety, sadness, etc. Overall, a kid creating an imaginary friend is doing it with a purpose. It is sure more fun doing things with others than doing them alone. Another thing we miss is that the kid creating an imaginary friend is the one dictating what game the two play, when to play, talk, or what they talk about. When playing with an imaginary friend, a kid will need to go back and forth from mentality to mentality to respond to him herself. You say this, I say that. Joseph that says this, John says that. Okay, Joseph's turn, John has to respond. Joseph, let's play. Switch to John. John says, okay, let's do this. And the kid is just jumping from mentality to mentality. This, when done for a long period of time, can create a sense of confusion for a child, distinguishing which one is the real one and which one is the created one. At some point, because he has to be the real one, but also has to be the fake one, his mentality can get mixed up. Was it me, Joseph? Was it John? Which one was it? Sometimes after a while, the kid creating the imaginary friend could lose part of his own self by allowing the imaginary friend to take over the decision making. This pushing back the original creator to becoming the second one in charge and or no longer leading but rather following. This takes place if or when the imaginary friend is projected to be stronger or smarter. If so, then the personality of the mentality of the imaginary fictitious friend could take over the mind of the host by setting him, herself, in the place of the original kid. Moving aside, removing, and or replacing the original character. By then, the original characters can become the fictitious one. One way to prove and or explain this is when the same happens with people that make up lies all the time, then forget their own lies or what the truth really is. These people at some point can get so mixed up that they no longer remember their lies or the story they first claimed, losing track or forgetting what they were saying first and change their story over and over again. This is how most people get caught lying. Another way to explain or prove the imaginary friend taking over mentality due to forgetting what it is what and who is who is by comparing the same outcome to the people that do a lot of drugs and constantly hallucinate. At some point when these people are flying in their mind, they get to imagine and have fun with their own visions, hallucinations, and thoughts. They can start to think what would be like doing something cool or fun. What would be like doing that? How fun would it be to do that? This, parenthesis, just like the kid with an imaginary friend, close parenthesis, is done by placing themselves and responding to themselves when they are imagining being in such situations. To the point of them, after many times tripping, not being sure whether they did something or went somewhere, or they were just tripping about going somewhere and doing something before, confusing the reality of what they've done and where they've been with the hallucination of what they tripped about. Back to imaginary friend. Sometimes the original kid, the one with the imaginary friend, would disagree with her imaginary friend, and they might unfriend each other or stop talking to one another for a while. This might be because the imaginary friend didn't want to play or follow anymore, or said something the original kid didn't like. This is mostly only possible when the original kid is still in charge. If it's the other way around, where the imaginary friend has become in charge and didn't like, agree, or was told something he didn't like, the original kid could feel forced to make up for the disagreement, like apologize. Sometimes the original kid and the imaginary friend merge together and both become one. There will be different variations of the outcome of the relationship with the two. Some other times, the original kid could create another version of a new imaginary friend, leaving the primary imaginary friend behind. And some other times, a kid could create multiple imaginary friends at once with different roles and different personalities. Usually a kid with an imaginary friend will create her imaginary friend to be of the same gender. This is due to the kid looking to have someone with similar likes and or someone with more things in common. Someone that will be into the same games and be more into doing the same things so they can have more fun. So they look someone with similar likes and wants. This compared to creating the opposite gender for imaginary friend. Usually boys and girls are into different things and they like playing different games. Because of this, the imaginary friend is usually of the same gender. But what will happen if instead of creating an imaginary friend being the same gender, the kid would create her imaginary friend to be of the opposite gender? To start, they wouldn't get along as well if or when the friendship is based on games and doing the same things that each other likes to do and play. But at the same time, they will get along much better if their friendship involves other things, like it is in the case of having company. Having company with the opposite gender can be taken to a much higher or farther level than what it could ever be taken with the company of the same gender. When it comes to the opposite gender, the kid creating, giving life and energy to imaginary friend, or the kid hosting the imaginary friend, in this case going to be a boy, because he is now around the opposite gender's energy projected to be in his fabricated entity, the hosting kid could reach a point of excitement, pleasure, happiness, and biological sensations. Things that usually could not get with the imaginary friend of the same gender, as the imaginary same gender sex friend is projected to have the same energy as his own, and the kid's natural biology is not receptive to it. Considering organic biological sensation responses can and will usually give the opposite gender imaginary friend a higher validation for consideration and preference when the host kid or the kid creating the imaginary friend creates them and chooses their gender. This is why a biological boy would choose to create their imaginary friend to be of the opposite gender and vice versa. This is why a biological girl will choose to create the opposite gender imaginary friend to be a boy. Considering the previous thing said, having the opposite gender for imaginary friend surpasses the sensation for company and fun of the same gender. Therefore, choosing the opposite gender for imaginary friend will make more sense as sensations are felt to be greater. Sensations choosing the opposite gender for imaginary friend will feel to be greater and will make more sense because the highest peak point of company, fun, and overall friendship between the host kid and imaginary friend of the same gender is brotherhood or sisterhood. But the peak point of company, fun, and overall friendship between the host kid and the imaginary friend of the opposite gender is having a romantic and sexual relationship or a heterosexual partner, which in a real world scenario will be having a heterosexual boyfriend or girlfriend. Ask yourself the same thing. How far can you take things with the same gender friends if you are heterosexual? Also, ask yourself how far could you take things with the opposite gender friends if you are heterosexual? One is no bang bang, the other one is bang bang. In conclusion, the factual psychological behavior of a kid having and creating an imaginary friend shows us that there are made up ways the mind can entertain us by creating scenarios and situations that can benefit us or work in our favor. So this is basically the main idea behind transsexuality. This explains the step process in the mind, in the response in their body by doing this. That leads to the reasoning why a kid would choose to do such thing, a boy or a girl, or even an adult. Transsexual behavior in the mind is comparable to having an imaginary best friend, scratch best friend, boyfriend, or girlfriend. Imaginary friends equals transsexuality. The purpose of the mentality of a kid creating an imaginary friend is to play, chat, to spend good time, to have fun, to cope with boredom, loneliness, etc. The same function found in the mentality of an imaginary friend, which is to serve a purpose and a role to benefit the host, exists and can be observed in the mentality of transsexuality. In both mentalities, both individuals split into two entities. Both mentalities create and use a fictitious entity to interact with it whichever way desired. In both mentalities, the host assigns their added fictitious entity a role. Both mentalities take the same step process for it to work and serve almost the same, if not the very same exact purpose. Both mentalities bring almost, if not the same exact outcome that leads their host to benefit out of their psychological behavior and engagement. A person's mind is split into two. A person's mind is split into two would take place to make room for an extra someone to settle in or move in. The same reasoning behind in our everyday life is when someone is moving in or staying over in our house, like a friend or relative. We would make space and would try our best to accommodate them in, making us split and share our own space. An imaginary friend is someone that was brought along to be friends. In transsexuality, someone was brought along to be a mate or a partner. In transsexuality, a created fictitious entity takes the role of a boyfriend or a girlfriend. The fictitious boyfriend or girlfriend is a created mentality that was brought along to keep company, share romance, sexual pleasure, etc. The created fictitious boyfriend or girlfriend gives the host what's necessary to comply with her own natural heterosexual biology. Transsexuality in the mind of a person is taken as a shortcut to substitute, simulate, and or successfully comply with their biological and natural reproductive instincts. The mentality of an imaginary friend and the mentality of a transsexuality both bring a second entity into one so they can fulfill what they are missing in their lives: company, a friend, romance, sexual gratification, the opposite gender, etc. So they can make their lives easier, more exciting, more comfortable, more enjoyable. I would say that the only difference between the psychological behavior and the mentality of having an imaginary friend and transsexuality is the extra steps needed to be taken with transsexuality. Transsexuality demands mental stimulation as well as physical structure, previously explained on subchapter Simulation of Feelings. This previous can explain the main statement on page 5 and 6 about the how and the why transsexuality is based on heterosexuality. Transsexuality is based on heterosexuality because an individual chooses to engage in transsexuality with the purpose to satisfy her biological, reproductive, instinctive heterosexual nature. The downfall of transsexuality. Being transsexual does not equals being two persons or entities in one. That is what is first believed at the beginning in the transsexual mentality. Individual hosting a second entity thinks that she or him can get access to the opposite gender's presence without having the opposite gender actually present. Individual hosting a second entity thinks she can substitute the presence of the opposite gender by pretending the opposite gender is in them with them. Then all they have to do is switch back and forth between male mentality and female mentality, or vice versa. This is what I'm talking about. Transsexuality starts in the mind of a heterosexual person thinking that through transsexuality they can bring someone else aboard with them to live in their world, to be on their time, to share their life, if you will. This is done with the intention to simulate and or substitute a heterosexual, sexual, and or romantic relationship with the opposite gender. As previously mentioned, a transgender person must behave like the opposite gender and through that behavior bring the opposite gender to life. The fact of this being true explains the devotion of a transsexual person contemplating and seeking to fully transition. In order to have the feeling of fully possessing the opposite gender, the transsexual person must transform more and more into it, just like I mentioned in limitations of transsexuality. The more they transform into the opposite gender, the more the feeling of the opposite gender truly existing. The more they can bring their imagination to reality, the more they can complete their added entity or the opposite gender as if they were building them piece by piece or importing them from somewhere else. Okay, I already ordered this from China. I'm gonna get the leg. Okay, now put it together. Now what do I need? I need the peanuts. Okay, let me schedule the surgery appointment or just leave it at the end and so on. At the beginning of transsexuality, a transsexual person hosting is in control of the relationship almost at full capacity or 100%. Being fully in charge in a transsexual mentality or in control is not possible because in order for transsexuality to work, the to be transgender hosting person or the person with gender dysphoria needs to divide or share themselves with a new entity in order for that entity to exist. So we can say that at the beginning of transsexuality, the hosting person is a 90-10% in control. 90% being them, the other 10% goes to the added entity. This is where we see little girly behaviors in boys or masculine behaviors in girls, amateur cross-dressing, rough playing in girls, interest of playing male-dominated sports, being soft if boys, etc. From there, the behavior can escalate and grow its percentage. It can grow from 80 to 20, then 70 to 30, 60 to 40, and so on. The problem is when the percentage starts to tilt too much to the added entity, when it passes the 50-50 line, when it becomes 40 to 60, 30 to 70, 20 to 80, because it can then get all the way almost to 0 to 100. By then, there will be major problems. Not realizing that the more they transform into the opposite gender, the faster they're evicting the host or the mentality of the original person out. By the time they are almost at 0% to 100, someone moved in and kicked the original entity out at the end of the rainbow. When fully transitioned, a transgender person becomes a single unit again. By then, there won't be any more sharing time, life. There will no longer be the possibility or ability to extract sexual and or romantic pleasure out of the second entity anymore. Since the good plus mental feelings merges by thinking they can get more through the behavior, AX8, once the transitioning is completed, this meaning once the highest level of behavior has been reached, the feeling of getting, extracting, or having will cease to be produced, exist, or be felt. Pretty much game over or game completed. Once all levels are done and the second entity is no longer present, there's no one else to give to, take from, or share with. The purpose of transsexuality was to bring someone along to take, share, and to enjoy with. So if one of the two entities is gone, then they'll become single or normal again. If or when they do, they'll become or feel incomplete again. That means that they will be back to where they first started. The unexpected opposite feeling result or outcome after going through a long process of fully transitioning and the results not being what they were hoping for can and will trigger the feeling of making all physical extreme modifications a big mistake or in vain. The feeling or realization of making a huge mistake can be a harsh wake-up call and or a big pill to swallow. When it comes to transsexuality, people will advance with their transition because they're either eager to gain more and to take more, or because it makes sense to get farther. The more they change and modify their bodies or transition, the more they can enjoy or extract pleasure out of their transsexual behavior and mentality. Unknowingly, most of the excitement of transsexuality is during the transition. That is why the thought of transitioning all the way is almost inevitable for most people with gender dysphoria, in this case, transsexual people. The reasoning behind transitioning all the way is because at some point, not changing all the way can become a stress in them, as if they're not doing enough to be the happiest they can be. Coming up short with their actions will mean they're not at their full potential of enjoyment, so there's still work to do. After all, you can't truly or fully bring someone along until that someone is truly fully here or there. In the transsexual mentality reasoning, the most realistic the second entity becomes, the most true and the highest the extracting and obtaining pleasure becomes. Transgender regret. Many transgender people, after finally being done with the excitement of fully transitioning, that is when they've done irreversible body modifications like surgery and hormones, will be then able to clearly see what they were doing to themselves. Realizing the cause of their mistake can trigger an overwhelming sensation of unhappiness, as they now see themselves in an estranged body or in the true wrong body. Can you imagine waking up to something like this? It's like you put all your savings, all your money, your retiring money on the stock market, and then you wake up and it's all being collapsed. How do you feel? What do you do now? Horrible. After all of the excitement of transitioning is gone, so will the feeling of well-being and pleasure. When the lack of feeling as good or as excited is absent, the feeling of being in the wrong finally settles in, or is finally acknowledged. Unless, of course, they are still not done enjoying their accomplishments. If it is the case of them seeing the modifications done to their body as unnecessary or wrong, there will be different reactions to their situation. Some will try to go back to the original self. This is when we see people trying to detransition. Detransitioning people are not rare. We see this often on the internet when and where people make videos speaking about detransitioning. Sometimes some people will be neutral about the outcome of their transition, as they are still enjoying their changes, or because they're not yet ready to consider making a mistake. Hesitating, regretting transitioning is understandable, as the transitioning will leave scars and many times irreparable damage. We could call this being in denial. Others, although perhaps regretful, won't try it or attempt to detransition, as they've walked and gone through a lot to turn around and start walking their journey back again. For these people, the way back is much too far and too long, so they'll settle where they are and try to build their lives from there. This last one is when we see transgender people date the same gender. Since they now have transformed into the opposite gender, they must now get with the opposite gender, which in reality is the same gender. This will be because if they are to get with the now same gender, which in reality will be the opposite gender, then that'll mean they were wrong all along, and or that will mean going against what they were originally fighting for, which can be embarrassing or hard to accept, as being wrong has consequences and can bring negative emotions like depression, guilt, sadness, anger, etc. Also, accepting to be wrong can mean having to go back to where they first started. So they'll just stay and continue their journey or life from where they are. That decision seems to be the least stressful response or choice available. That is until the same response becomes uncomfortable to live and keep, and they have to face their mistake or reality. There will be others that will attempt to detransition but will stay somewhere in the middle, recovering some of what they were while keeping some of who they brought along the way. These people will be giving percentage control or power back to the original entity while preserving a percentage in the added entity. So they go back, but they don't go all the way back. Others fall into depression, causing instability that can lead to unfortunate actions and reactions. The highest depression point after deception of the huge mistake of irreversible modifications when completely transitioned will take place in silence. Statistically, fully transitioned transgender people will opt out of life within 7 years after fully transitioning. This isn't a coincidence. Finally, others will move on to start a new journey, where they can once again find a high level of good plus feeling, that or consider looking at any of the previous choices. One of the possible new journeys unhappy transsexual people can take will be to become an activist, bringing awareness to the possible unwanted or unexpected outcomes based on their own not so unique experience. This is when we will see groups of ex-transgender people trying to assist others with the same or similar situations, helping them consider to make different choices than the ones they did, sharing their story, and through their story advise them, so they can prevent repeating the same many times, sometimes irreversible mistakes, warning others that at the end of the rainbow they didn't find the pot of gold they were looking for. Detransitioning. Detransitioning will take place, marriage or occur, once an individual starts to miss themselves, once the biological person transitioning or transitioned feels left out, controlled, and or overpowered, and decides to break up or break free from their now new oppressor, parentheses, their second entity, which by then is their new identity, close parentheses, and want to take control of themselves back. Detransitioning will take place, marriage or occur, once an individual has grown bored of playing over and over and over the same thing, where she don't like where things are going anymore, where she no longer likes or finds positive the results or outcomes found. Detransitioning will take place, merge or occur, once an individual does not like the new changes or beginning of things. All of these conclusions mentioned above can and will lead transsexual people of all stages, amateur, cross-dressing, medium-low, coming out of the closet, medium advanced, taking hormones, advanced, changing names and adopting new identities, very advanced, daring to do surgeries, completed, full genitalia modifications, no more surgeries available, to decide to want to wander off elsewhere. So they'll start to separate themselves from the consideration of transsexuality and begin to doubt their sexual stance. This is when they will finally dare to start to consider possibilities and probabilities they used to push away, they want to hear or listen to before. Doubting sexual stance on transitioning and decide to detransition or walk away from the option to transition often takes place after many things are pushing them to reconsider, like on biology, surroundings feedback, obvious aspects in their structure, comparing unfitting scenarios, long-term commitments, feeling conflict responses from their everyday analysis. Like, if that's me, how come I still like these other things? If that's me, how come I only enjoy certain things during certain times for a certain while? If that's me, then why do I feel like that sometimes or not all the time, etc. The doubt on their sexual stance comes down to whether or not they're fully convinced transitioning is what they want for themselves at the long run or anymore, and or all the unanswered question marks about their stance have become loud enough to pay attention to. Unanswered question marks are the facts most people with gender dysphoria miss to consider because they still don't know any better or choose to ignore. People with gender dysphoria will ignore unanswered question marks because they still yet can hear them, as they know little to nothing about the subject, and or simply because they are not yet ready to listen to those question marks. Usually they won't be ready to consider or listen because they are still unsure whether or not sexual value they can extract out of the transsexual behavior is something truly positive, as in they want to make sure the outcome is worth it or not. Not listening or considering facts is a very common behavior on all types of people who aren't sure what to think, especially those around us, like our children, friends, spouse, etc. They don't care to listen until they've gone through a lot of uncomfortable outcomes that they finally break. When they break is when they finally decide to listen and start recognizing their mistakes. A relatable example to the reasoning behind changing stance about transsexuality and choosing to detransition is the reasoning behind the mentality of a person being in an unhealthy relationship, where and when at first they don't want to break up, but over time, after many negative experiences, they finally decide to break up or break free from it. Unhealthy relationships are what we mostly commonly know as controlling or toxic relationships. At first, when a person is in an unhealthy relationship and doesn't want to consider breaking up, it's because they are attached to the idea of love, goals, dreams, expectations, or simply because of the pleasant feeling like sexual pleasure they can get out of the relationship. A person who's not willing to leave behind the possibility or probability of any of the things previously mentioned is unlikely to deny themselves being in that type of relationship. So they would often choose to conclude to look for any other solution or option that does not involve ending their relationship. People who are in a toxic relationship and are not yet willing to break up will put up with things, dismiss red flags, and will avoid paying attention to the negative comments others will make or say, etc. Most people in toxic relationships that are not yet ready to consider breaking up or breaking free will try to work things out, will let things slide, blame themselves, blame others, and will even excuse disrespectful behaviors from the other person. People in a unhealthy or toxic relationship unwilling to consider breaking up will keep holding on to the relationship by putting up with bad things and will make sacrifices in order to keep what they like and want out of the relationship. So they will be far from willing to consider many opinions or answering to unanswered questions just yet. Over time, after many bad outcomes and very possibly unstable future, people in toxic relationships can and will start to reconsider their stance or will doubt wanting to be or grab onto that relationship anymore. When this happens, these people will be more willing to listen to reasons for not being in that toxic relationship and will finally be more willing to review any unanswered question marks that were left blank at the beginning. This previous example of finally deciding to break up or break free from a toxic relationship is the same step reasoning that takes place in the mind of the person with gender dysphoria that then decides to detransition. The main relevance between the two compared scenarios, the consideration to transition and the no longer consideration to transition mentality or detransitioning versus not willing to break up a toxic relationship and then willing to break up or break free from it, it's the unwillingness to let go because they get to feel or benefit from the interaction, behavior, and or engagement. Also, then finally reaching to the point to be willing to let go and move on. It is a normal behavior in many of us to endure, protect, and fight for what we want. Whether it's emotions, desires, needs, expectations, goals, fear to be alone, fear to not have or not benefit from sex, love, anymore. Until people in unhealthy relationships have had enough negatives or unpleasant results, they will keep on staying in that relationship simply because of what they can get out of it, hoping things will get better. But when things don't change or become worse, then they'll finally decide to consider moving on. Same as with people with gender dysphoria or people transitioning. They will avoid the thought of leaving transgenderism behind because in transgenderism they can find things they like new feelings, new hopes, new dreams, new emotions, new pleasure, new possibilities and probabilities. Until people with gender dysphoria get to realize the true cause of transgenderism, like it is permanent, irreversible damage to their biological anatomy they tax their body with. Like when they take hormones that change or modify their body structure, hair, voice, and when they have one-way genital surgeries. Until they stop lying to themselves, get bored, tired of being controlled, and decide to take control back from their possessive identity, until they find what they were looking for somewhere else, or until they finally realize, understand, and most importantly, accept their mistakes, they'll take X amount of time to get back in track. Detransitioning is part of the process of transsexuality, as it is part of the reasoning of the subject to conclude how positive, negative, necessary, or unnecessary their behavior is or was. Many, if not most people with gender dysphoria at any transgender stage will go through the detransitioning process, thinking, consideration, and many will actually walk away from the transsexual behavior. Statistically, most kids with mental gender dysphoria and or with transgenderism concepts will move on from the thought of transitioning by puberty and will leave it behind for good. Studies have showed that most boys and girls with gender dysphoria have a high percentage chance to grow out of it by puberty. Odds are for boys growing out of gender dysphoria are 77 to 94%. Girls' odds are 73 to 88% chance to correct their identity issues. Odd percentage to correct their identity issues by puberty in young adolescents and kids will significantly drop if they have biased adults or ignorant people concealing factual information and are only feeding them false scenarios, dreams, possibilities, and hopes. In other words, if they have LGBT propaganda. For those that will continue with the gender dysphoria, changing, advancing, and transforming will almost be inevitable until they are ready to deal with all of the unanswered questions they are suppressing, ignoring, and or leaving behind. Unfortunately, some get further than others before they get to review or consider unanswered question marks. For them, transgenderism would have had a high irreparable cost. Detransitioning from transsexuality can be a longer process to some than to others. Some with mental gender dysphoria will kick or grow out of it during a shorter period of time. Others will need a lot more time and changes before they make up their mind. This ultimately explains why not all transsexual people choose to detransition, or not all people with gender dysphoria walk away from the consideration of transsexuality at different times than others. Cross-dressing. Cross-dressing is the act of putting on or wearing clothing specifically designed to be worn or used by the opposite gender. Transsexuality is derived from cross-dressing. Cross-dressing is one of the most noticeable steps leading to transsexuality. Cross-dressing usually comes first or before transsexuality, then it evolves to the idea of transitioning. However, there are more steps other than just cross-dressing before contemplating the idea of committing to transsexuality, and sometimes they are not as noticeable. There will be signs or hints when a kid or a person is having doubts dealing with their sexuality, have gender dysphoria, or are mixing up their gender understanding basics, like simple biology. A noticeable, not too noticeable sign or hint a biological boy having trouble dealing with or doubting their sexuality can have is that from time to time he decides to make fun of things with a girly voice and with girly actions or behaviors. He will make fun of things or will make fun of people he's referring to while imitating their actions and reactions in a girly way just to be funnier. Also, when they make certain movements or stand in certain girly ways without them even noticing or doing them on purpose. In this previous case, following through or developing commitment to transsexuality can be a very low possibility and or probability, unless this imitating or mocking behavior as the opposite gender becomes a thing he does over and over and over again. When people choose to make jokes regarding or including sexuality, in this case act, carry, move, pretend, and express to be and do as the opposite gender, it is a way to touch the subject and mentality without touching the subject and mentality, and or touch the subject and mentality in a safer way, which is to do it with the disclaimer, excuse, reason, or purpose of just being funny. However, even when only being funny, someone can and will be accessing the opposite gender's territory. This mentality crossing over to the non-belonging behavior can lead to transsexuality. The reason is that even if they are doing it for a different reason and only slightly or temporarily, at the end they are still stepping foot in the non-belonging mentality. A more noticeable sign to transsexuality is when boys have the inclination to wanting to be doing all of the things the opposite gender do. Playing with girl toys or dolls, hanging out in girly places, identifying more with girls, having role models that are girls, or being way more feminine than masculine, etc. From there it can spread to cross-dressing, misgendering themselves to adopt new identities. Words as well as behaviors, items and clothing can give people access to the transsexual mentality. You want to prove that I'm right? Go ahead and put on a bra and act girly. Go ahead and paint beer on yourself and act masculine if you're a girl. No? If your answer is no, you want to know why? Because you don't want to step in that territory that other people cross over or do step on. Boys identifying as girls. Boys with gender dysphoria will come to the conclusion of identifying as girls because they find themselves relating more to girls than to boys. The reason of this emerges from the feminine boys having more ties to the girls than with the masculine boys. From likes to enjoyment of similar interests in common, like beauty, femininity, softness, etc. Because of all that, feminine boys will relate and identify more with girls and will often confuse their reactions, likes, and relating scenarios to them being girls. Likes and similar interest in feminine boys with girls is due to their heterosexual biology responding positively, being around or being in contact with girls and girly things more than being around with boys and or in contact with boys things. What happens is boys with gender dysphoria who identify as girls will do so because they will be in indirect direct contact with girls through girly things like behaviors, reactions, responses, items, dresses, painted nails, etc. Both which will trigger their proximity sensation to being in close contact with the opposite gender or with feminine girls. Same thing takes place in the mentality of biological girls with gender dysphoria, but towards boys and boys things. This previous or above mean that feminine boys like feminine girls, not masculine boys. Feminine boys enjoy being closer to girls and do girly things because biologically they are more attracted and more interested in girls than in boys. So they mixed up what they like with who they are. This is mostly the gender dysphoria in younger kids. This behavior reasoning is like when we compare our likes, preferences, and relate them more to people from other backgrounds or race and end up concluding that we are no longer our own race. That rather concluding that we just like more the same things. I like sleeping, I like salmon, I like nature, I'm hairy, I like honey, I'm strong. Oh God, I might be a bear. These examples, as silly as they may sound, have the same principle as the one with believing to be the opposite gender. The difference is that the bear example is at a much lower intensity level, therefore much more obvious and easier to see, respond, and comprehend. When it comes to sexuality and biological responses, answers can be less clear, simply because many answers, good or bad, can feel good in us. This is due to our sexuality being charged with pleasant outcomes that can trigger our biological sensations. Pleasant biological sensations can and will confuse kids and or people of all ages much more easier than the previous bear example. Biologically speaking, hanging out with boys and being in contact with many things don't trigger the feminine boy's reproductive biology the same way being around girls and indirect contact with girls does. Boys would like being in indirect contact with a girly side for the simple fact of them really enjoying and liking being around feminine energy, not because they are girls or one of the girls. Boys that are feminine or transgender can in fact be straight or heterosexual. This means that in instances, transgender boys or boys with gender dysphoria or feminine boys are not as confused as they seem to be. This is the reason many male adults that used to be feminine as kids and many adult females that used to be tomboys grow to be completely heterosexual when adults. This also means that the theory of feminine transgender boys or boys with gender dysphoria being actually girls born in the wrong body can now be challenged. Feminine, transgender, or boys with gender dysphoria are by boys' heterosexuality responding biologically normal to the opposite gender presence, energy, vibe. Feminine boys, boys with gender dysphoria and or transsexual are heterosexual boys enjoying their pleasant mental and physical biological responses of being in indirect contact with the opposite gender through feminine energy or presence expressed with acts, items, sounds, colors, etc. More explanation of this ahead in subchapter transferred feelings. People with gender dysphoria, like feminine boys and masculine girls, are not the opposite gender trapped in the wrong body. People with gender dysphoria, like feminine boys and masculine girls, are just confusing their biological heterosexual normal responses. Limits of transsexuality. As mentioned in conclusion of shortcuts, transsexuality has its limitations. One of the biggest limitations transsexuality lots of times has is loneliness, due to sexual romantic transsexual encounters only being close to the real thing. Transsexual people are missing the full romantic and sexual experience of being 100% fully them and 100% fully having access to another person. Unlike in transsexuality, when and where there's two entities inside of one, in heterosexuality there are two full entities or persons sharing, exchanging, giving, and receiving pleasure. At the beginning of transsexuality, loneliness is not usually felt, especially if or when the person with gender dysphoria is willing to overlook that detail. A person with gender dysphoria will choose to overlook the loneliness detail with the purpose to get on to continue having and extracting pleasure and fun from transsexuality. Second biggest limitation in transsexuality is the limitation of access to full enjoyment. This is because when a transsexual relationship is compared to a heterosexual one, transgender people can observe that in heterosexuality there are two 100% full entities or persons interacting with one another. Unlike in a transsexual relationship, when and where a singular person splits into two entities and each get and share a mere percentage. Having two 100% entities is undoubtedly more satisfying than being partially one and partially another one. Acknowledging this fact will mean to have to leave transsexuality behind and start looking for a heterosexual relationship instead. Some will leave it, some will take longer, and some just won't. For the people with gender dysphoria that chooses to not leave transsexuality behind, the idea of transitioning will be almost inevitable. The basis of the reasoning in people with gender dysphoria not willing to leave transsexuality behind are the follow and in no specific order. Number one, why wait? People with gender dysphoria don't want to wait to get when the moment is right. So they'll just settle for what they can get their hands on at the spot. Number two, uncertainty. People won't let go of what they can get through transsexuality because they fear losing what they already have or are getting. Because if they do let go, they don't know when they could get again. Number three, secure the price. People with gender dysphoria would rather get something there and then over not there, not then, or nothing at all. Number four, easier access. In here, people with gender dysphoria will be unwilling to leave transsexuality behind because they don't want to pay the full retail price to access the result of heterosexual sensations and pleasure. People with gender dysphoria think that they can get the same sensations and pleasure at a fraction of a cost in a transsexual relationship. Back to limitations. The two biggest limitations of transsexuality are not being able to fully be present when getting, giving, sharing, and receiving, and being lonely by not being able to fully have someone else present to do the sharing, exchanging, giving, and receiving with. So there being a limitation of loneliness and limitation of restriction of not being able to enjoy full access to the added entity in transsexuality because the added entity is not at a 100% in them, with them, like it is in heterosexuality. This will push a transgender person to consider that something is not right. At this point, people with gender dysphoria can either take this result as a chance to live and walk away from transsexuality and current pleasure behind or not. If or when by then they are still unwilling to leave transsexuality behind, a person with gender dysphoria or transsexual will conclude that bringing their added entity to 100% is what they must do to make things right. What is 100%? 100% means one full entity. The added entity in transsexuality being only a percentage, that percentage can increase or decrease, refer to the downfall of transsexuality. The higher the percentage the added entity is, the more real the added entity can become, the more the added entity can come to exist. Therefore, transitioning or becoming the opposite gender more and more is the way to solve their facing problem of restriction to fully access their enjoyment like it is possible in heterosexuality. In other words, transitioning is the way to compensate the lack of benefits and results in a transsexual relationship when compared to results and benefits a heterosexual relationship offers. So to bring down the barrier of limitation of access, the added entity must become 100%. The only way to do that without leaving transsexuality behind and all its perks will be to fully transition into the opposite gender. Full transition will be the bulldozer needed to bring down the barrier between them and their full access to pleasure. But fully transition would only make the limitation of loneliness even stronger, because if or when one of the two entities become 100%, the other one disappears and there's only one entity again. Transgender people will need to deal with two major limitations: one, full access to pleasure, and two, loneliness. Most transgender people will deal with the pleasure limitation part first, then they'll deal with the loneliness limitation after, but they can do it randomly. In here, yet again another chance to leave the contemplation of the behavior and mentality of transsexuality behind. However, if they don't, then one of the most notorious or common way to deal with the loneliness limitation is to actually physically have someone there with them. People with gender dysphoria whom are unwilling to let the option of transsexuality go will deal with the loneliness limitation part by finding similar people to identify and hang out with, usually other transgender people or any LGBT people, etc. That way they're no longer alone if they have others with them. People with gender dysphoria whom are unwilling to let the option of transsexuality go will deal with the loneliness limitation parts by trying to find and fight for support, sympathy, acceptance, reassurance, celebration, etc. from family members, social media, random people, etc. They do this because if they are reassured, accepted, and supported in their decision making, they'll take that as people telling them that there's nothing wrong with their transsexual choices. Therefore, they'll translate that into there's no need to change, so no more loneliness. Ever wonder why LGBT people get so defensive when people don't agree with them? Explanation of the why on page 143. People with gender dysphoria whom are unwilling to let the option of transsexuality go will deal with the loneliness limitation part by dating someone that can fit their transsexual narrative. Someone a transgender can date to fit their transsexual narrative will be someone of the same gender. A heterosexual, same biological gender that is straight. This can allow a transgender give their identity 100% of them and also no longer be lonely. Sometimes transgender people will also date other transgender people of the same biological gender and do this because they can do and enjoy the same things together. This type of relationship often doesn't work because when it comes to sexually interacting, the conditions involved cause friction. The two transgender interacting sexually with one another need to take turns switching to their own mental heterosexual biology to please the other one. But then not really, because the other transgender person they're sexually interacting with is not truly the gender they're claiming to be. So they're actually being gay, but at the same time they have to act straight. If one of the transsexuals wanted to be heterosexual, they would have chosen to date the opposite gender in the first place. Also, the opposite gender at that moment will be much more pleasant to be with because it is not an imitation or a copy. Surprisingly, parentheses, but actually most fitting solution to be able to keep transsexual narrative alive, close parentheses. A transgender biological male or female will date other transgender people of the opposite biological sex, making it be a heterosexual relationship combined or fused with a transsexual one. You ever see this? A biological male pretending to be a female dates a biological female pretending to be a male. This part becomes very interesting because we can find the mental solution or mental cure to transsexuality. A transgender dating other transgender of the biological opposite sex comes from the reasoning of finding four beneficial things. Number one, not leave transsexuality behind. Number two, not want to fully delete or erase themselves. Number three, bringing down the limitation of loneliness. Number four, be able to fully be present when absorbing, exchanging, giving, and receiving. Some of these four things can be done through dating the other options, but seems like only some of these four things or partially. Transsexuals that date other transsexuals of the biological opposite sex do so because they will find a way to bring down the limitation of loneliness, and unlike by the means of other options, also enjoy their own sexual biology more. Through the transsexuality of the opposite gender, the heterosexuality of each transgender can actually be more present to absorb, exchange, give, and receive. This is possible because each transgender can use the opposite gender's transsexuality as a means to give back or add back percentage to the biological self-host identity that was reduced to a mere percentage and almost to zero to give the second added entity maximum percentage to fully bring it to real life. Both transgenders of the opposite gender that are dating each other will mentally place themselves in the transgender's opposite gender's physical and mental place, which can then match the heterosexual benefits and intensity with no barriers, limitations, and most importantly, without the need to leave transsexuality behind. So out of all the options that involve leaving transsexuality behind, what don't belong to them, they can actually get to keep what they don't want to leave behind by being with someone that does exactly the same thing. Biological opposite gender transgenders dating one another seems like the perfect solution to benefit all sides. In some cases, it can be. However, the problem with this is that one of the two or both transgenders won't like to be in this type of relationship. Because one of the two or both transgenders don't really find the transsexual opposite gender they're dating to be as full of an entity or as credible being the opposite gender they are pretending to be, simply due to the other transgender not being perceived as feminine or as masculine each other would like. So the guy pretending to be a girl don't find the girl pretending to be a guy be much of a man as his added entity would like to be with. This can affect the level of gratification or pleasure intensity when having sex. Eventually, one of the two or both biological opposite genders, transgenders, dating one another, if they manage to stay in a relationship like this because they are in contact with what they first wanted or were looking for, and at the same time in touch or in contact with their own hosting heterosexual side, they could start to turn back to their original biology on their own. So what I found to be the answer to transsexuality or the cure is placing a masculine girl that finds herself to be transgender and a boy that finds to be also a transgender, and have them interact, but not just any type. You have to observe the girl and what she's into. So whenever a transsexual boy or girl or person transform into the opposite gender, that opposite gender they're trying to turn into is a projection of what they desire, yearn, they will want to have. So when you put a masculine girl and a feminine boy, they can fulfill each other's desires, and that actually can bring them back to their own biology. So it's just a matter of time, but make sure you put so if the girl is like masculine girl and into cowboys and all this stuff, then make sure you put the boy that is like feminine girl, but he's like projected to be what a cowgirl will look like, and they can help each other come out of the state of mind, because transsexuality is nothing but a state of mind. Eventually they could get to realize that it would be much easier and less time consuming to be heterosexual or themselves since the beginning. Realizing they already have all the requirements needed to fully have access and no limitations with their current partner, they'll conclude that they no longer need to modify themselves to absorb, share, exchange, give, and receive. Unless, of course, they split up because they didn't like the relationship anymore. Unless they split up because they can't keep being in the relationship anymore. Unless they split up because they're more in love or more loyal to their own mental and physical transsexual relationship they have with themselves. Unless they split up because they have other sexual tendencies like homosexuality or deeper sexual issues and aren't just transsexual. People with gender dysphoria do like their own biology, but they like more the opposite gender's biology because they are more attracted to it. Reviewing. Having limitations in transsexuality prevents people with gender dysphoria enjoy their sexual and romantic encounters to the full potential. Having limitations in transsexuality is why people with gender dysphoria will feel the need to transform or transition more and more into the opposite gender. Transsexuality's aim purpose is to bypass the process needed for a second entity to comply. Transsexuality attempts to substitute the benefit and the access result a heterosexual relationship offers. Transsexuality alters the order of the process needed for a transsexual, sexual, and romantic encounter. This is why I tell you that transsexuality is based on heterosexuality, and this is why I tell you a transsexual person is actually heterosexual. Transsexuality is based on heterosexuality because true transsexual people, even though they behave, claim, and many times constantly insist to believe to be the opposite gender, they are still craving, pursuing, and engaging in a heterosexual, sexual, and romantic encounter result. Before we continue, why do transsexual people have to insist so hard being the opposite gender? For 5 major reasons and in no specific order. 1, as previously mentioned, they don't want to have any objections to their chosen behavior because having objections make limitations exist and or be highlighted. Number 2, they have to insist, else they don't believe in the existence of the added entity, and if they don't believe in it, then their added entity will give them, the host, less pleasure at the moment of sexual and emotional interaction. The more they believe in it, the more pleasure access they can take, get, extract, or absorb. Number 3, not doing so will be taken as a betrayal to the added partner, as if they were turning their back to them, as if they were being disloyal. Number 4, because if they don't insist, they don't believe to be right, which means they could be wrong, which will mean to no longer go that direction or let their imaginary added entity go. Number 5, honestly believes that the opposite gender is in their head. This is due to the switching back and forth from mentality to mentality. Therefore, the added entity is the one responding. Hey, I'm over here. I exist. Back to the subject. Like with everything else in life, there will be variants in transsexuality. Question is, what happens to the people that are somewhere close to the middle of transgenderism, whom don't go all the way with it, but also neither leaves it behind? Somewhere close in the middle of transgenderism behavior and mentality, there are people who will settle on a certain point of transsexuality and are just comfortable enough to not move forward with the progression of the mentality and or with the progression of the behavior. These settlers are also not willing to move backwards or leave behind their current journey and interaction with the transsexual mentality and or behavior. These people that settle somewhere near or close to the middle of transsexuality will settle for an always varying and definite amount of time. Semi-transgender people are people that will partially engage and or partake in transsexuality and at the same time will also engage or partake in heterosexuality. Surprisingly, many semi-transgender people consider themselves to be mostly, even fully heterosexual. Semi-transgenders are those people who only partake in transsexuality whilst mostly living as heterosexuals. Semi-transgender people like to cross-dress, there are levels on everything, and do enjoy pretending to be the opposite gender. But don't commit to claim to be the opposite gender, at least not just yet. Because of this, oftentimes these people won't seek to fully transition, will transition very slow, or won't transition much at all. A semi-transgender person is any person who shows some type of restraint and or control over their gender dysphoria. This can have to do with the gender dysphoria being more mild or lighter. Usually, semi-transgenders mostly only enjoy cross-dressing and pretending to be the opposite gender in private. Parentheses, ever seen people get caught wearing the opposite gender's underwear underneath their heterosexual clothes? Close parentheses. This specifically, I can refer to a video of a Hispanic guy being pulled over by the cops. He was wearing cowboy clothes and, that sombrero hat, and he looked, like a cowboy type of thing. So he's placed in the back of the truck and he starts being searched. They lift up his shirt because his shirt was tucked into his pants. So they pull it up to see if he has any weapons. And to the shock of everybody, he's wearing a red thong. And you can see the thong straps coming out of his pants. And that's the type of people that I'm referring to. Or during specific events like drag parties, intimacy, during self-pleasuring, etc. So behind doors. Semi-transgender people are often confused or labeled as gay people being in the closet. When gender dysphoria people is at a high level, or these people are just passing near the middle where semi-transgender settlers are located, sometimes they can be in the closet, but it's more because they are not settlers themselves. In most cases, transgender settlers, people whose gender dysphoria is mild to medium and still consider themselves to be heterosexual, are not much or at all into the same gender, which means they are not in their closet. To be more specific, being in the closet or not depends on how far people with gender dysphoria are willing to take or push their sexuality to. Sometimes semi-transgender people will try to be with the same gender to try to push and join more pretending to be the opposite gender. But this causes conflict in them because they are not into the same gender biology. Rather, they partake in transsexuality or are semi-transgenders because they are very much into the opposite gender's biology. So much that unconsciously and consciously to have and to be in constant contact with the biological traits of the opposite gender they're biologically heterosexually attracted to, they'll try to capture, collect, and even host those traits in themselves, all with the purpose of having and enjoying those traits more and more often. Semi-transgender and true transgender people are heterosexual people who collect, capture, and host the opposite gender's traits in them with them to enjoy them more and more by having them at reach for quick access at any time and utilize those traits to sexually and emotionally satisfy their own heterosexual biology. Don't people get married for the same reason? The result a semi-transgender person is after can be obtained through two ways. One, being in love in a heterosexual relationship with the actual opposite gender that satisfies their heterosexual biology all the time, as much as needed, desired, or possible. This option is the one that often leads to getting married and having a family. Number 2, by mentally to physically adding and creating a fictitious entity in them to give all those traits desired in their ideal heterosexual partner and give this added entity the role of a sexual and romantic heterosexual partner. In other words, give the added entity the role of a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Semi-transgenders are people that don't devote themselves to follow all the way through the same steps a fully committed transsexual person does. Semi-transgender people are holding on to their heterosexuality because they are into the opposite gender and are not into the same gender. They are straight, not gay. Semi-transgender people are pretty much one foot in heterosexuality and one foot out of it. One foot in transsexuality and one foot out of it. The semi-transgender behavior and mentality explanation is the missing information or the complementary explanation of a current incomplete psychological categorized behavior explanation known and called autogynephilia. Autogynephilia, parenthesis, although it will be best called semi-transgender, close parenthesis, is a different categorized behavior and mentality than transsexuality. Yet the behavior and mentality of autogynephilia, of semi-transgenderism have the same beginning concept or foundation as the behavior and mentality of transsexuality. Although perhaps not yet fully understood, the mentality and behavior of autogynephilia, a semi-transgender, and the one from transsexuality are both based on the same belief and or purpose, but at some point they break apart from one another. Although currently not stated or yet recognized in current 2025 psychology, the true difference between both of the two mentalities in individuals, parenthesis, transsexuality and semi-transgender, is that a semi-transgender person, previously autogynephilia, does not get overpowered or yields full control to their added fabricated fictitious entity. This means that a semi-transgender person doesn't give more than 50% control or power to their added entity. Therefore, their added entity does not have the rights to make final choices on behalf of the host. Not yielding control over final decisions, referring to a biological male previously with autogynephilia, now that is some semi-transgender, will be because the masculinity in him is stronger than the personality given to the fabricated feminine side. This is likely because the semi-transgender person hosting a fictitious entity has more of a traditional based relationship going on in his mind, where the male leads and is on top and where the woman submits and follows. This traditional relationship is many times reinforced by the male at some point yielding to their added feminine entity control over decisions and then regretting doing so. As an example, some of these biological males with a traditional based semi-transgender relationship would try same gender encounters or homosexual behavior just to yield to their added entity, but to them at that moment, because they consider themselves to be heterosexual, that will be having their women with another man. Aside from disliking the taste, the odor, and many times the painful experience, traditional strong men don't take lightly sharing their women. There are records, such testimonies and statements from males that cross-dress, date, and identify as heterosexual, previously known as biological men with autogynephilia, now semi-transgender biological men, that enjoy cross-dressing while having heterosexual relationships with their biological girlfriends or wives. This is due to, at the moment, these semi-transgender men are mentally enjoying two ladies at once. If the actual girlfriend or wife does engage sexually with his mental girlfriend, it'll be taken as not a big deal because he's being part of it, and or because neither of his women are being sexually intimate or shared with another man. Semi-transgender men go as far as calling themselves lesbians to easier explain these types of situations. LOL. The fact that biological males cross-dress or semi-transgender males do exist, whom consider themselves heterosexuals, do enjoy dating the opposite gender, do not claim to be in the wrong body, and do not seek to fully transition or much at all, indicates and reinforces AXA or alternative approach explanation theory, stating and claiming that transsexuality is based on heterosexuality, because both a transgender and a semi-transgender add and use the opposite gender's physicality and mentality to satisfy their biological heterosexual instinctive drive in an alternative way. People that seek to transition all the way is because their gender dysphoria is not yet under control. Their reproductive drive is misplaced, are confused due to lack of information, or have not yet determined if their behavior is okay to keep or needs to be let go. Therefore, they yield too much control and or power to their fictitious entity, consciously and unconsciously submitting to their gender dysphoria, all with the idea, purpose, and goal to gain access to top peak pleasure. Seeking top peak pleasure is a normal state of mind most people have with anything they do or interact with, and there's nothing wrong with it. That's not a problem. Put on makeup, do it like a professional, lift, be the strongest, compete, be number one, etc. Yet, when this top peak normal state of mind drive and pursuit is misplaced, is when and where we will find the reason explanations why people end up with different conclusions. It's like a math problem. Add or subtract just a single number in an equation wrong and get totally different results. So in context, the difference between truly trans and semi-trans people are that full transgender people want to change into the opposite gender, as they give in to their gender dysphoria almost entirely. Semi-trans won't, because they don't give their added entity more control or power than the amount they keep. So that's the difference between semi and full. One bows down to their sexual gratification or devotes more to it, if you will. Other one does much less. Neither of both is after the same gender, but if their fabricated entity is and the host is under the fictitious entity control and or wants to make their addition fully valid, as in making it exist and be real, then the host will put up with the same gender being involved, willingly and unwillingly. That's the end of chapter 3. Hope you liked it. I really like it. I think it's a very eye-opening. There's a lot of explanations in between. I'm sure a lot of people are going to have a lot of questions. I'll get to them little by little. We're going to move on to chapter 4. Chapter 4 reinforces and closes the gap of skepticism in people's mind, as this chapter will answer a lot of questions. Transfer feelings, chapter 4. I'll see you next time.